Greetings from the Henry County Historical Society, the oldest continuously operating organization and museum of its kind in Indiana. My name is Darrell Radford. I'm the co-director of the Historical Society and Henry County's official historian. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you today for this special Black History Month presentation. Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by African Americans and a time for recognizing their central role in U.S. history. Also known as African American History Month, the event grew out of Negro History Week, the brainchild of noted historian Carter G. Woodson and other prominent African Americans. Since 1976, every U.S. president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. In its 200-year history, Henry County has been blessed by many black citizens, good, hard-working people who contributed and continue to contribute in many ways. No one knows that better than our special guest today, Mr. Ricky Lee Cottman. Ricky is author of arguably the most comprehensive history of Black Americans in Henry County. His 425-page book, In Colored Circles, was published in 2020 and continues to be an enlightening resource for anyone interested in Henry County history. Ricky joins us today as the Henry County Historical Society celebrates Black History Month. Ricky, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Darrell. Glad to be here.
This is a fantastic book. Tell us, how much time did you invest in this and what motivated you to write it?
Well, it was about a 20-year journey. My first inclination to try to write this book came from my aunt, Thelma Bailey, who gave me a short history of our family that dates back to 1792 when my third great-grandfather was born.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, in South Carolina was where he was born, and he ended up being a slave in Virginia, which was West Virginia. So she triggered my interest in our whole family history just from that article. And then also from a distant cousin of mine named Dr. Coy Robbins, who was a professor at Indiana University. I was able to meet him in 2001, saw extensive file cabinets of Black history from towns all over Indiana that he had amassed over probably a 40-year period. So that's kind of where I got my inspiration to write the book.
The title is intriguing to me. Where did that come from?
In Colored Circles. Yeah, In Colored Circles was a social newspaper article that was written probably on a weekly basis that kind of delineated what was going on in the community in terms of religious information, social information, visitations with other families, and things like that, that just, continued from probably about 1916, 15 until about the late 1930s.
This is a no-holds-barred account of Black history in Henry County, the inspirational and the tragic. Let's go chapter by chapter for some of your insights.
Sure.
Chapter 1 is called Stereotypical Cartoons, Minstrel Shows, and Bad Front Page News. Describe for us some of the stereotypical cartoons that you might have seen.
Yeah, the stereotypical cartoons, they graced the newspaper probably from 1907, and again, didn't end until the late 1930s. They showed Black Americans with huge oversized lips that were white, large feet, women who carried razors in their bosom, cartoons about chicken thievery, things like that just were not very flattering for Black Americans to have to see and endure. Folks thought that was probably just making fun or whatever, and it wasn't harmless, but it was pretty degrading.
Mm-hmm. Then there was the bad front page news. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, the bad front page news. I mean, there was one in particular that said Luther arrested again for rolling the bones. And front page and headline in the paper. And it's like somebody who was arrested for shooting dice. And so they would put on front page news, public intoxication, domestic disputes between families, things like that were just didn't need to be relegated to the front page. If they wanted to report about it, it should have been second, third page, or whatever, but not front page,
What did the minstrel shows consist of?
The minstrel shows, it goes to a series of programs that were developed back in the 1800s where white men would dress up and put burnt cork on their face and exaggerated lips, using not proper English, and it would be a program where there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Interlocutor and then Mr. Bones, and it would be a back and forth conversation between those two individuals, with using improper English, and then there would be a musical show along with it that would depict things like being on the plantation and other songs that were kind of demeaning and stuff like that.
Certainly not putting black people in a very good light.
No, not at all, not at all.
Chapter 2 is about personal achievements and family triumphs. Tell us about your family, Ricky, and some of their triumphs.
My family, like I mentioned earlier, was my aunt gave me a little article about our family. My third great-grandfather, Abram and Annie Johnson Cottman, were slaves that lived in Fairmount, West Virginia, but at the time it was called Middletown, Virginia. And they were owned first by the Newsom family, and then they were sold to Reverend Joshua Hickman, a Baptist minister, and he and five other families, his family and five other families, the Millett, the Veach, the Ice, and Hickmans, and the Beavers family, all traversed down the Monongahela River to Pittsburgh, then down the Ohio River to Cincinnati, and then they bought oxen, and they brought their oxen with them, and they bought wagons and came north up the Connor Trail and settled in Springport area. And my family stayed there until about 1846, and then they moved to Randolph County and lived in a black settlement, a black farming settlement called Cabin Creek. And from there, about 10 years later, they traversed on over to the county line, state border in Randolph County and Darke County, Ohio, and lived in a community called Longtown, Long, Ohio. And three sides of my family came from there, not only the Cottmans, but my mother's family, the Bass, and as well as my grandmother's family on my dad's side, the Burden family. And so a long history there. The family eventually ended up moving to Portland, Indiana in the early 1900s. My grandfather and grandmother lived there, and then they had my aunt and my dad, and they had another brother who passed away. And then in 1930, my aunt came to Newcastle because she married a gentleman named Walter Bailey. And so she had my father then come down here in 1936. And Walter worked at Chrysler, and so Dad got a job at Chrysler, and that's kind of how we all got here. And then there were five members in my family. My older brother, Jay, and graduated in 1956, Tom, 1960, my sister Sue, 1965, myself, 1970, and my younger sister, Julie, in 1971. Four of us are college graduates, and we're all pretty well retired now, except Julie. She still works as a hospice nurse. I worked as a social worker for the state of Indiana for many, many years. My brother is an artist and musician, and then my oldest brother was a U.S. Postal employee supervisor.
Obviously, a lot of talent in your family.
Yeah,
and,
we have some artistic overtones. My son is an artist and lives in Austin, Texas. My daughter, she lives in Indianapolis, Indiana. And my brother is quite a well-known watercolor artist in the Phoenix, Arizona area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you could go back in time and those folks in your family tree that were slaves, and show them what you have accomplished here after the struggles that they had early on, what would they say, do you think?
Oh, I'm sure they'd be blown away by that. They'd be like, college graduates? What? Musicians? Artists? So the family history too goes back and talks about, we had several ministers in our family. One of my great-grandfather's brothers was Abraham Cottman. He was a a bishop in the AME church here in Indiana and moved to New York later on. And another one of his brothers, Ezekiel, actually was a minister in St. Louis, Missouri, and was a pastor for Madam C.J. Walker before she became.
Is that right?
Before she
Oh my
became
gosh.
before she became famous. She lived in St. Louis before she moved to Indianapolis.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and his congregation was her.
And obviously Indianapolis now has the Madam C.J. Walker, is it a theater auditorium?
Yeah, theater.
And that's a pretty historic site there in
It
Indianapolis.
is. It's been down on Indiana Avenue since the 1920s, I think.
Have you seen performances in that
Yes, I have.
facility?
It's been over 25 years ago, probably when I did go to one there. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I have been there. It's a pie-shaped building that's shaped like a slice of pie, the way it's made, and down there on Indiana Avenue, where there were lots of nightclubs and entertainment that went there throughout.
I would think that had to be a special feeling to be an audience member there and to think, my goodness, I've got kind of a tie to this person.
Even though at that time back then I did not know it.
Oh, you did not know it.
But I found out later, when I did the research on my
Wow.
my great uncle Ezekiel.
Chapter 3 covers community and social issues, and you've titled it The Good, Bad, Proud, and Ugly. Can you give us an example of each?
Yeah. The good, probably the institution or the founding of the NAACP chapters that happened right here in Newcastle. The first being in the 1930s. Instrumental in that was Reverend Samuel Criss, who was the first president of the NAACP. He fought vigorously for the right for blacks to be able to ride on what they called jitneys, or coaches that ran around town, like forerunners of cabs, and so he was the first president of the first incarnation of that.
They were not able to?
They were not able to. No, they were not able to ride. They said these were private organizations that could operate however they wanted to. There was no city code and this was in the 1920s, even in the 1930s. Yeah. So.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
That, and then the other chapters, 1950s. Una Mae Winslow and Charles Maudlin were very instrumental in both of those. Charles was quite an awesome guy. And then the third incarnation happened on my watch in the 1980s, and that was when Reverend Charles Harrison came to town and questioned why there were no black police or firemen or anybody in city government whatsoever. So yeah, those were some of the highlights of that particular topic.
And we've made some strides in that area.
Oh,
we've
yeah.
had, of course, we currently have a black fire chief,
Yes.
Mr. Boatwright,
Mr.
Mark Boatwright.
Yes, he just recently retired.
Oh, that's right. He retired.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
him, Darren Clemens, who
yeah.
retired, he was the police officer, and Fred Thurman, who passed away.
Yeah.
Was they were all hired in 1988 after a concerted effort with the city government back with the Bud Ayers, and had a lot of cooperation too with Sherman Bowles,
Yes.
and when he was mayor.
Having worked at the Courier for several years, I covered some city council meetings and remember when David Cody was a member of the city council.
Back in the early 90s, David ran and was a member of the city council for like 4 years. And another gentleman, Ed Walker, had previously ran for city council, but was not elected.
I remember him.
Yeah, Ed's still around.
Very good guy.
He's still around town here.
Yeah. Well, what about the ugly?
The ugly. Oh yeah. Well, I guess you could say the ugly had to do with when probably the Ku Klux Klan.
I thought you would say that.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's when they were here in the 1920s, and chapters from Muncie came down, and a lot of the meetings were held at the Elks Club here in town.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And there were parade marches down Broad Street, and they would go out to the fairgrounds that were out on 31st Street, and there were 600-700, people that were here marching, But the 1920s was a bad chapter in terms of the Klan involvement in Indiana. So I'd say that, and then they returned again in smaller group, maybe 10 or 15. I was president. I was a freshman at Ball State in October of 1970, and they came and marched around the courthouse. I'll never forget these guys. They had their open faces on. They had their white pointed hoods and their white robes, but they had armed guards around them with nightsticks, no guns or anything like that. But I can remember being there, and a friend of mine, Kenny Archie, was just as belligerent as he could be, setting some of their literature on fire, throwing it up in the air, cussing and ranting and raving at them.
my
But
goodness.
nothing went down. You know, they marched
Yeah.
around the courthouse for a short period
So there
of time.
wasn't really any violence.
No
or
violence,
anything. It
no,
was just,
no. But we knew that the word had spread that there was going to be, the Klan was going to be here. And I'm sure out in the crowd, there were guys in black suits and sunglasses that were probably
Right.
FBI or you know,
Yeah.
some kind of, just to be sure that, nothing crazy went down. So that happened again in the 1980s, I think, too.
Yeah. I was at the Courier. I was managing editor when the Klan came. I think it was on a weekend. And this was probably in the 1990s, late 90s, or maybe even early 2000s. And I remember that the publisher at the time, Mr. Wes Rowe, he and I met and we talked about a strategy. What we wanted to do was to make sure people knew about this event, but we had decided in advance we were not going to cover it in any way, shape, or form. And we wanted to encourage people to mark the date on their calendar and to stay away from downtown, because that's what the KKK feeds on. They feed on attention. And so it was a very interesting time, and certainly we hope that those days are past us for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned about the bad also, in just some tragic things that happened, some murders. Like one took place out in Bluntsville in 1890. A gentleman by the name of Eli Ladd was he was raising Cain in town, and they wanted to get him out of town, so they were shooting. He was shooting the town up, and well, they just wanted to run him out of town. So they finally got him to go, but as he was leaving town and trying to leave town, he was chased and shot while standing on a fence, and collapsed and died there. And understanding is they actually took and hung his dead body up as well. But there was a gentleman who was convicted of the shooting and spent a couple of years in prison for that particular shooting and the murder of him. Another was in probably 1906. This was more of a family matter. It was the murder with arsenic put in coffee that killed Mr. Reuben Bailey.
Really?
His son-in-law had been having an affair with his wife's sister.
I see.
And so he thought he would just decide, he didn't, and it came to light that she might be pregnant or whatever, and she was going to tell the whole story, and kind of that gentleman, her husband, was convicted of that murder and spent 25 years in prison.
Chapter 5 had to be so much more enjoyable for you to write. Sports history.
Oh, yeah.
So many great black athletes have played here. I have some of my personal favorites. John Boyd, I remember John Boyd, and he played for Indiana University, was a tremendous wide receiver. He played on a football team in 1979, I think it was, that was like 8-2, and just so much fun to watch. Obviously, you've got Darnell Archie, who was one of the catalysts to get Butler University on the map. I think they went to the Sweet 16 one year that he played. Even today, I still cover some sports from time to time. Meredith Boatwright. No, I'm getting his name wrong. Quentin Boatwright. Quentin Boatwright.
During football season.
Yeah. Quentin was just so much fun to watch, and man, he zigzagged all over the field.
He did.
Those are just a few that come to mind for me. What about you? What are some of the ones that you remember?
Well, I go way back to like in the early 1900s. I think Snowball Merida, John Snowball Merida, who was from Splicing, Indiana, who played in the Negro leagues of baseball when in those days baseball was not integrated, and some of his family ended up here in Newcastle, and you'd be surprised that the last name was Merida and Meredith were almost interchangeable.
Oh, is that right? Oh.
And so in the Meredith family was Herb Meredith, who was a football player for Newcastle back in the 50s, and his brother was Billy Ross. Billy Ross, who Billy and Steve played on the 1967 Trojan basketball team that went to the state finals and lost in the afternoon game of the state finals. So going back, Snowball Merida was one of the sports persons that come to mind, and another one was a gentleman that I knew personally, who played on the 1917-18 Caddis Spaniards basketball team.
Really?
He was the first African American to play sports basketball in Henry County. His name was Eugene Hansard. And I would meet him sometimes. He was a building contractor. He did cement work, brick work, built his own house out here on Indiana Avenue in between 21st and 18th Street. And I knew him, and he passed away probably in 1984, but I would have many conversations with Gene. He never talked about that though, but but he was. And then so he, and then the Mukes family. Estel Mukes was a basketball player that ended up at Earlham College in the 1940s. Played basketball for Earlham. His cousin was Victor Mukes, who played on Newcastle Trojan basketball team in the 1950s. Played on the Newcastle Olympians, which was kind of a semi-pro basketball basketball team too.
I remember Victor. In fact, I think I was involved in a pickup game one time and was amazed because Victor had to be probably in his 70s at the time, but he could still shoot.
Yeah.
He could still move really well. Just a great player.
Yeah, a lot of those games were held at the Armory. They played a lot of them at the Armory, and the Olympians was quite a team. But those other players, you mentioned Johnny Boyd, but Mike Boyd was a good basketball player for, and he was on the staff at Michigan when the Fab Five played.
Yes,
he was a staff member there, and Mike finished up his coaching career at East Tennessee State just a few years ago, and is retired. Now lives in Florida. He was a good friend of mine growing up. Yeah.
Yeah. Does he come back around?
Not much since their mother. The last time they were here was when their mother passed away, and then a sister who was a cheerleader. Both of Mike's sisters, Trudy and Tony, were cheerleaders for Newcastle, and Trudy passed away about 3 years ago. That's the last time I saw Mike and the whole family that were here.
What was their mother's name?
Bernice.
Bernice
Boyd.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She. Her brother was Jim Turner, who was a very good football player for Newcastle, in one of the first football players for Newcastle, as well as a guy named Pookum Roper. Pookum Roper was a four-star athlete in baseball, track, football, and basketball, and quite a guy. He worked with my dad at Chrysler.
Chapter 6 is sure to be of interest to many Henry County history enthusiasts. It's about abolition and the Underground Railroad activity here. There's a lot of that, wasn't there?
There was a lot of that. I gleaned a lot of my information from a book written by Dr. Thomas Ham, professor at Earlham, and a lot of that information indicated that in 1841, the Henry County Society for Abolition was organized by many of the women there in Spiceland. Seth Henshaw ran a grocery store in Greensboro. And would not sell any articles that were made in the South, and was a major influence in terms of abolition and Underground Railroad, involvement in the Underground Railroad, along with many other people in the Spiceland area, and even the William Trail family. William Trail, being one of the early black settlers here in the county, participated in that as well.
And you and I were just talking beforehand about the William Trail family cemetery that has now been pretty much cleaned up.
Yes, it has. It's on the family farm. That was a family farm at that time. He came here from as a runaway slave in probably 1814. He was in the Fayette County area, and then finally moved to Newcastle area out by Greensboro Township near Shirley. In 1832, at one point owned over 1,200 acres, and on that plot of land of his is the cemetery where there's about 40 stones. And so I was able to go out there and help clean that up back in November of 2021, and I think it was again cleaned up this fall.
My understanding is that, I'd always heard Frederick Douglass was here. I think it was 1843. He had been attacked in Pendleton by a mob, and that Seth Henshaw was instrumental in giving him some refuge, some safety. Is that your understanding?
Yes, he did, and he brought him to Greensboro, and he spoke at a place called Freedom Hall that was there, and there's actually on the site of where that was, that may be the name of what it is now. Maybe it was Liberty Hall back then. And I think Freedom Hall is built now right across the street from the Methodist Church right there in downtown
Greensboro. Yeah, yeah.
Right there. But yeah, and then I think he ended up over in Richmond and had some trouble over there too. But yeah, that as far back as that, yeah.
Yeah, we just shared on our Facebook page recently an account of when Frederick Douglass came back. He actually came back to Newcastle in 1876 and spoke at the Henry County Courthouse.
Wow, that's a bit of
And,
information I missed. I didn't pick
yeah,
up on that.
you know, it was very descriptive in the way that he presented himself, that he was a little older, a little slower, but he still had that fire in his voice, and still very passionate, and still telling people, even though he came back this time as a free man, that there was still a lot of work to do.
Oh yeah.
So, Chapter 7 covers Black American churches and cemeteries. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah. One of the first black churches organized was called the Second Methodist Episcopal Church, and that didn't last too long. That was in probably the early 1870s, 1860s. But then in 1877, Wiley Chapel was organized. And
1877.
1877.
That's a long time ago. I didn't realize it went back that far.
It went back that far, and it eventually became Wiley United Methodist Church. But it was formed in 1877 in a house of one of the parishioners there, and then finally the first church was built around 1890, and it was on 19th Street between Thornburg and Spring. And there right now there's a house that sits on that area where it was at, that was built by the school that does they do buildings of houses around, as a trade
vocational school. I think career programs.
Career
is what they
programs.
call it now.
Yeah, they built a house on that same site, and that was and then 1890 it burned, and then they built another church 1821 on the corner of Thornburg and 18th Street, and that was we eventually built the new church, which was at Shop Avenue and 21st. And sadly, though, Wiley Church kind of became dysfunctional after a lot of the members passed away. We were
That
down
happens.
We were down to like 11 members.
Yeah,
and so that church was essentially just given to First United Methodist. And they've continued to use it. It was called The Place. And even Reverend Harrison, who was instrumental in helping build that church, Charles Harrison, would come back on Saturdays and do some services, and on Sundays. And occasionally he still does that today. But right now the place is it's not as prevalent as it was prior to COVID. The other church was Bethel AME Church, organized in 1919. It was kind of it was kind of an offshoot, and that sits at the corner of Shop and 18th.
And that's still active today, isn't
That
it?
church actually was active, Daryl, only up until about 2 years ago.
Oh, only about 2 years ago.
Yeah,
Really?
and finally it dwindled down to 4 or 5 members, and was closed, sadly. But it belonged to the African Methodist Episcopal Conference here in Indiana. And then, of course, the Bethany Tabernacle.
Yes.
Bethany Tabernacle was founded in 1865. 1965, excuse me, not 18. 1965, when the Reverend John Fonser moved here with his family from Marion, Indiana. And at one point in 1991, his daughter, Juanita, and himself, they were all recognized, and I think Joan Stairs was involved also with this as George Herbert
George
Walker.
H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light.
1,000 Points of Light. And that church is still in operation and is functioning. But a lot of the members who were in Bethel, AME, and Wiley have integrated into other churches. I mean, particularly myself, I go to Grace Baptist Church, which was my wife's family church, is where I go. And I know other folks go to Trinity United Methodist, and other folks have gone to First United Methodist. So, it's a good thing that there are, and that there are those opportunities, and it's not, I mean, churches should be open to anyone, and they are, and they are.
Chapter 8 is about military history. Tell us about some of the black soldiers from Henry County fighting for the red, white, and blue. And as I say that, one picture comes to my mind. There's a picture of several black citizens, black men, sitting on the courthouse steps, and I think they were getting ready to serve in World War I. Have you seen that picture?
That's true. That's true, and that's what's on the cover of my book.
Oh
Actually.
yeah, I knew I'd seen it somewhere.
Those are the guys that were ready to go, and were drafted in like 1918. They didn't see, some of them didn't see much service time at all, but a couple of them did. One gentleman in particular was who I knew and was very, very close with in church was Eugene Bailey, who was a bailiff at the courthouse in Judge Hayes' court, and his wife was Minnie Bailey, who was very much involved in church history, and then Archie Hill was another person who's on that in that picture there, and those guys were sitting on the courthouse steps. Yeah, the first though African American, it's hard to believe this, but it's true, named Amos Brown, and he was involved during the Mexican War in 1846.
Really? Now, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was
Wow.
he was a cook in the army outfit there, and a lot of the guys were were fighting, and they were like, hey, we might need some extra help. Why can't we get Amos? Why don't we induct him into the army?
Mm-hmm.
And it was tossed around and talked about, and finally did happen. And so he was known probably as the first African American to be a member of the U.S. Army. Others, the William Trail family, who I mentioned about, had 4 sons that fought in the Civil War. 2 of them actually died in the Civil War. One at Petersburg, which was a pretty bloody battle,
Yes.
and another one died from injuries afterward. But 2 of his sons came back. And then we mentioned World War I, World War II. There were several, the Underwood family, the Bassett family, the Archie family, all fought in World War II, Korean War, even Dickie Archie fought in World War II and the Korean. And then another gentleman was joined the Air Force in 1954, Reginald Wright. And Reggie Wright was in the U.S. Air Force, stationed in Germany, stationed in Taiwan, and then states around, and things around the country, stations around the country as well. And his story is quite interesting too. He retired, and he was as a Chief Master Sergeant. He was also on an elite corps of people who were bodyguards for President Kennedy when he visited.
Is that right?
When he
Oh my
visited
gosh. Wow.
particular military bases and things like that. There's a picture of him with his back turned, and he's facing outward, and it shows President Kennedy that I have. I think it's in the book that I have that picture in the book too, that shows that. But Reggie passed away, oh golly, probably about 13 years ago. He was only about 70 years old. So yeah, those bring to mind some of the military feats and accomplishments.
Wanted to mention some of the colorful characters in the past. One that comes to mind is the guy that wears the "I like Ike" buttons.
Oh yeah, Doc Weaver.
Doc Weaver.
Doc Weaver. He lived about a block from me, and he was related to the Williams family. He was related to Wilma Williams, and his family originally came up here from Tennessee in the 1870s. And you'd see Doc walking up and down Broad Street, sometime in the hot summer, have on a heavy brocade coat with an umbrella on his back, hooked over his back shoulder, and a big brim hat. And that picture was taken by the photographer Tom Petty.
Tom Petty, yes.
And it's
yes.
alleged that actually sat on Eisenhower's desk
Yes.
in Washington, D.C. during Eisenhower's time as president. Doc Weaver, yeah, quite a character.
We had used that picture on our Facebook page recently, and I'd never heard this before, but there was one lady that commented the reason that he carried the umbrella all the time, even on hot sunny days, he'd carry an umbrella. And the reason he did was that he did not have an umbrella one time in a downpour and caught pneumonia and nearly died. And so he was always wanting to be prepared. He didn't want to ever go through that again. I don't know if you've heard that story or not.
I didn't hear that second part of the
Yeah,
story, but that's believable. That's for sure. Yeah.
A guy that I became very familiar with at the newspaper was Charles Maudlin Sr.
Oh yeah.
And he was something else. He was in the Senior Olympics multiple times, wasn't he?
Multiple times, yes, yes. From the 100-yard, 200-yard dash, you know, you could always see him walking around town. He usually wore a sweatsuit. It was either white, gray, or whatever, and he always had his necklaces, gold necklaces on. Had his head shaved, wore his earring, and you'd see him stretching all over town wherever he'd go. Very, very much involved in what was going on. You'd see him downtown before downtown offices were reopened and businesses reopened. He'd be down there sweeping. He would sweep up some of the entryways into some of those just around. He was always a kind of civic-minded kind of guy, and his family was, you know, quite well educated. Well, his daughter is a psychologist in Houston. His son is a medical doctor in Cleveland, Ohio, Charles Maudlin Jr. And so quite a well-rounded family.
You know, it was a thrill. Like I say, he came into the newspaper office probably at least once a week. And I tried whenever I could. Sometimes he'd come in on deadline, but I always tried to give him a little bit of time and attention, and it was always a pleasure talking to him. And one day he came in with his medals. He had like 5 or 6 of his medals around his neck, and he wanted me to pose with him for a picture out there in front of the Courier lobby. I still have that.
Oh, right.
And in fact, I think I had that put in the bicentennial booklet that we did recently. But just a wonderful, wonderful man.
Yeah, he was. At his funeral, his son gave me one of those medals.
Is that right?
He did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was in 2010 when he passed away.
Chapter 9 is about demographics and the beach settlement.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Yeah, demographics primarily. What I did was I went through the census records, the U.S. Census records, all the way from the beginning when African Americans showed up in this area in 1830. That was when 1830 the Winslow family was one of the first families that settled down around Strawn. And then from that, after that, about my own family, 1831, but you know, we weren't free until we were brought to Indiana. Then our freedom, even though we were brought to Indiana and given our freedom, we stayed with the Hickman family for 15 more years before, you know, they could have left and gone anywhere they wanted to go, but they had quite an attachment to the Hickman family and decided to stay in this area. And so that, as far back as 1830 is when the first records of census. By 1840, there were many more families, 50s, 60s. Families came and migrated here from North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, you know, all the way up until the 1940 census, which closes out in my book. But I've pretty well listed most of those families by decade who were here, who came here, and the rough estimates on the years that they came here. And so that's, you know, for demographics primarily what I found to be the most interesting. The second part of that was your question.
The Beach Grove settlement?
Yeah, the beach settlement. The beach settlement was a black farming community founded around the 1830s also from folks that were brought here with Quakers. And they settled, though, in northern Rush County. But a lot of those families eventually bled over into Henry County and, you know, as years went by, but that was in northern Rush County near the town of Carthage. And the last known farmer that was in that area was a gentleman by the name of Eli Archie, which is related to my sister's husband's family, Dennis Archie and Sue and Janice Archie. But Eli, there's a book out called Northern Seed, Southern Soil. That's out. That's published about the beach settlement. I think it's in publication that you can still find. But that family that organized the beginning of that was called the Roberts family. And so the Roberts family also, they left and migrated to Hamilton County and founded what's called the Roberts settlement over there as well. And they still have a reunion over there that's been going on for over 100 plus years. The same thing at the beach settlement. Every year in August there is a kind of a camp meeting that they have where they go back to the church that was originally built there, that's been renovated, and it was the founding church of the Indiana chapter of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Beach.
I see. Uh-huh.
But a lot of those families have migrated to Knightstown, eventually to Newcastle. The Walden family, the Archie family, the Jones family were some of the instrumental families from the Beach settlement.
Very interesting. Your book closes with a chapter entitled In Colored Circles. Can you give our audience an idea of the overall theme in the final chapter?
Yeah, in the last chapter, it really talks about the social interactions that went on among the families, church activities that were reported in the newspaper, and visitations as well. And so that last chapter was where I got the name for the actual book, because it was a published weekly newsletter in the Courier from about 1916. Yeah, that's where I got the name.
I understand you're quite a musician, and I thought it would be kind of fun, if you're okay with it, to close our conversation today with a bit of music from Ricky Lee Cottman.
All right. Well, I'm gonna sing a little snippet from a song called "King Jesus Will Roll All Burdens Away," and it kind of goes like this. When I should feel so sad, why does my heart feel glad? Why does my soul feel so happy and gay? For all round me burdens fall, yet I'm not worried at all. For if I pray, King Jesus will roll all burdens away.
Amen. Wow. I can't thank you enough. This is a tremendous book, and I would encourage anyone interested in just history in general to consider picking one of these up. We have this book available at the Henry County Historical Society. Our normal business hours will resume Thursday, March 2nd. We will be open from 1 to 4:30 p.m. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of each week after that. We're also available by appointment anytime. Call us at 529-4028. I've been posting a Black History tidbit on our Facebook page with much of the information of that coming from Ricky's book. Please visit and like our page. You might want to join the 4,200 others who are now followers. Thank you very much for celebrating Black History Month with us today. For the Henry County Historical Society, this is Daryl Radford wishing you happy trails on all your historical quest.